Okay, we are live and we're just going to give folks a second to tune in. It takes just a moment once we kick this live, and we're just going to send out a quick tweet and let people know that the event is there. So thank you guys for tuning in today. Hey, Scott, can
Hello.
you wear some headphones?
I have some headphones on. Can you not hear me?
I can hear you. One
Okay.
second. There it is. It was YouTube trying to play things again. We're
Oh,
good.
I hate that.
Yeah, the YouTube auto starts. All right, well, we got 6 viewers, so welcome everyone. We're up and running. It's Google Plus decided to do a redesign, which is engineering code for move all the buttons. And so it only took me 43 tries, and that's only exaggerating by maybe 10, how to actually get today's Hangout started. So thank you, Google, for moving the start button. So we are here today where we're going to talk about other buttons and cameras and things that are much easier to use and much more fun to use than Google Hangouts. So thank you guys for joining us. My name is Rich Harrington. I am the publisher of PhotoFocus, and joining me today is my good friend and the founder of PhotoFocus, Scott Bourne. Scott, welcome. You have spent a lot of time shooting pictures through the years. Tell folks a little bit about your love of shooting landscapes.
Well, I actually am known as a bird photographer, but if you put lots of birds in a nature setting, it's called a birdscape. So I learned how to do landscapes so that I could do birdscapes. And basically, I like to shoot everything. My primary focus is on birds, but I like to be in nature. So when the birds aren't around, I will take an occasional landscape photo, and I've done it a lot over the years and been on a lot of landscape workshops. And today I want to go over some of the basics for people.
Great. Well, Scott, tilt your monitor down just a little bit towards you. And folks, remember, there is the Q&A pod, so you are welcome to ask questions. So hello from Michigan. Hello, John. Thank you. And hello from the UK. Some of you who've been here before have figured out that we pull from the question pod to be able to actually give away prizes periodically. So we will be doing that. We'll be giving away a copy of Perfectly Clear later today. And I'll also give away a couple of copies of Scott's new ebook on Americana photography. Scott, tell folks a little bit about your new book.
Yeah, I decided that I wanted to try a new personal project. So I went out after watching shows like American Pickers and the old road show on PBS and thought, this antiquing stuff is what we called it in the old days, is getting kind of popular with photographers. So I went out and decided to create a project for myself about Americana photographs, and in the process of that decided to write a book, because the best way to learn about something is to write a book about it. As
Yeah.
you know, Rich.
Yes, I'll let everybody in on a deep, dark secret. Anytime I decide to write a book, it's because I figured something out somewhere between halfway and 2/3. And the pressure of a deadline and the fact that you really had to learn it really pushes you over that edge. So that does work well. Well, Scott, you've put together a presentation today. We're going to take a look at some of your photos and share some lessons. And this is interactive, guys. So if you have questions that you want to ask us, and we'll do our best to get to them. And we're also going to show you some post-processing techniques to bring more out of your landscapes. I'll show you a little bit with HDR and raw processing and sharpening and fixing some of the tone and depth. So we'll talk through all that. So Scott, why don't you go ahead and take your presentation live, and we'll jump right in. And again, folks, if you have any questions, feel free to ask during this webinar. We're happy to get to those questions and to try to make sure you understand how to get the most out of landscape photography. So Scott, go ahead and launch that full screen if you would, and share your screen.
I'm clicking the button as we speak.
No problem. It's the green screen share button. Should be on the left-hand side there. There we go. Perfect.
So do you see it?
I see black, but now I see it. There we go. Landscape photography. Perfect.
All right. This really should say Basic Secrets to Landscape Photography by Scott Bourne and Rich Harrington, because Rich is going to be a part of this too. I'm not the only teacher here today. Rich has got a lot of good information as well on this subject, but I'll get us started on the basics, Rich, and you stop me whenever there's a question or whenever you think it's time to interject.
Perfect. And guys, again, feel free to ask those questions.
All right, let's start with the question everybody likes to ask first, gear, because after all, every kind of photography, including landscape photography, is merely an excuse to acquire gear acquisition syndrome, right?
Oh, yeah. We like to buy gear.
This is a photograph I made back in the film days, actually, and scanned it. This is at Monument Valley in Utah. And one of the easiest places in the world to do landscape photography. Stevie Wonder could do landscape photography here. There's so many great shots. All right, let's start it with gear. First of all, anything that you can buy today, Rich, all these cameras today are really good compared to the cameras of days gone by. And pretty much any camera that you have will do. That's one of the nice things about landscape photography. You can make anything work, but that said, something with interchangeable lenses usually offers the most flexibility. You can go all the way to DSLR full frame sensor quality, especially if you like to print big or you're going to do billboards or commercial applications, but Micro Four Thirds and APS-C are just fine for landscape. And this includes cameras like the Panasonic GH4, the Fuji X-T1, X Pro 1, X Pro 2, the Canon DSLR range, the Nikon DSLR range, all sorts of cameras. It really doesn't matter what kind you have. If you don't have a camera and you want to buy one specifically for landscape, look for one with good resolution and interchangeable lenses, and you're in good shape.
And I want to put one thing out there, Scott, we'll talk about this in a second. One of the things with landscape photography that's gotten so much easier through the years is stitching panoramas. And I'll show you a little later on how easy this is right in Camera Raw and Lightroom. But that's one way around it. A lot of people are like, oh, I have to buy the 42 megapixel beast so I can capture the whole landscape. Sometimes it's better to go with a tighter lens and to stitch multiple pictures together. It's easier than ever before. Zero nodal point required.
Yes, the nodal point discussion. Ron Brinkman would be proud. This is an inside joke, folks. Yeah, Micro Four Thirds, which has the smallest sensor of any of these, can be just fine. If you stitch, 9 or 10 photographs together, horizontally and vertical, you can make a megapixel image. So you're right. That's a good point. The main thing is you want cameras that will allow you to make your settings manually. P is not for perfect, folks. You take the camera off P or program and instead, start to experiment with things like aperture priority, manual controls, so that you can be creatively in charge of how the camera will render the image. Now, in my opinion, for landscape photography, if you want to get serious about it, tripods are a must, because you might be making 2-minute exposures in some landscape photography situations. And I don't care about how strong you are, you can't hand-hold for 2 minutes and get a sharp image. And by the way, while we're going to mention tripods are one of those things you really don't want to skimp on. If you're thinking about the $50 tripod at Best Buy, my advice is go see a movie, buy popcorn for $4, and forget about it, because it's not worth it. Save your money up for a decent tripod. And you're also going to want to get a ball head, a separate ball head with an Arca Swiss style tongue and groove system is my preference, because that allows you to mount the camera in such a way that it's rock solid stable. It will never shake loose or come off. And these systems are a little bit expensive, Rich, but they're what the pros use.
Yeah, and to that end, guys, things have gotten a lot easier on this front. We're seeing a lot of manufacturers use Arca Swiss. It's not just the premium brand name ones. There's lots of options out there. And what's great about this is you can get things like an L bracket, which will allow you to mount the camera horizontally or vertically, and it makes things like that stitch panorama a lot easier. But you're right, Scott. It's always tempting to skimp on the tripod. We ran a survey recently, and while we found that almost every photo focus reader owned a tripod, most of the time, more than half the time, people just left it in the car or back home. This is the sort of thing for landscapes where take it out of the car, backpack with it, use it. It's really, really worth it.
Yeah, and I use Really Right Stuff tripods. Unfortunately, they're the most expensive, but they're also super duper strong and lightweight. And occasionally when I need to use multiple tripods and I can't afford to spend that much money on lots of them from Really Right Stuff, I will go for some of the great tripods from 3Pod that Anorama carries now. They're really affordable. So you can get a tripod for around $300 now that's workable. In the old days, I wouldn't have been able to say that. Let's talk about what you want to shoot. The great news is, when it comes to landscape photography, I don't care where you live, within 50 miles of where you live, there's something beautiful you can photograph. This happens to be at Zion National Park. That's where I made this photo. And this is actually part of a stitched panorama, Rich. This is only 1/3 of it. But I picked this third because this is the third where the light was coming through the clouds in the middle of a storm. And sometimes storms are your friend, particularly if you're a landscape photographer, because they create these interesting moods and settings. This looks like it could be something in the background set of a Game of Thrones movie or something to me.
And to that end, guys, there's some great apps out there for tracking storms, things like Dark Sky and Weather Underground, where you can actually set alerts to let me know when it's going to be stormy or high chance of rain so that you can get yourself out there. Sometimes the worst conditions to be out from a picnic point of view are the best times to be out from a photographic point of view.
Absolutely. And the good news is a lot of the new cameras are weather resistant. They're no longer calling them waterproof, but they might as well because they're pretty much waterproof. You got to work really hard to ruin a camera with rain, so don't be afraid of that. So here's some just real generic ideas on what to shoot. This is by no means a white paper full of every potential landscape subject. These are just the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff that you can find. I don't care where you live. There's either a lake or a pond or a creek or a river or a stream or an ocean near you somewhere, unless maybe you live in the desert in Southern California. And even then, you're not more than a couple hours by car from one of these. Waterfalls are one of my and Rich's favorite subjects. We both like to photograph waterfalls. There's just something soothing about them, something that's just really hard to ignore. And there's lots of great waterfalls all over the world. Mountains, well, we have lots of those in the western United States where I live. In fact, I can see Mount Rainier almost from my front window, 14,411 feet tall. Mountains are always great to photograph. Trees, you got a forest somewhere near you, I promise. And there are all kinds of trees. And if you just want to have fun someday, go out and walk amongst the trees and just look at the details, look at the bark, look at the plant life at the bottom of the tree, look at the insects. There's so much to photograph with just one tree sometimes. Canyons, and I'm not just talking about the Grand Canyon, although that's a fine place to make landscape photos. All kinds of canyons, even a small gully wash leading to a creek where you live can look like a canyon in a photograph. Forest, sunrise and sunset, pretty much anywhere makes a landscape great. Rich, do you want to add anything to this list?
I think, as you're looking for opportunities, I'm a big fan of things that have foreground and background. And so areas with vegetation, not just a mountain, not just the side of the road, sometimes pulling a little further off. I find these days I'm looking to stack my photo and to have different things. And if I am there, sometimes I'll go to detail work and then I'll go to broader, go much wider. I don't know. One of the things that you taught me, Scott, is shooting from different angles. I've started doing a lot of these from higher angle or low angle, putting the camera to the ground just to really get a sense of nature or an ant's eye view. I think your list is pretty fantastic. I just try different angles. Like these days, I've been doing some tree photos where I go right along the base of the tree and shoot straight up to see the branches reaching into the sky. Just trying to get different angles of this rather than the same postcard ones that everybody else takes.
Good point. This is another, I can't believe how many film shots I have here. This is a film shot. This is when Saguaro National Park was merely a national monument. And this is near Tucson, Arizona. Another one of my favorite places. Sunsets there are spectacular. And when you're shooting a sunset, which we had on that list previously, remember that sunsets are kind of boring unless there's a strong foreground object to give you some sort of scale. In this case, I've got a giant saguaro cactus that's probably 50 feet tall in the foreground. It's so tall I can't even put it all in the frame. And it sits as silhouette in front of the sunset, which makes it a whole lot more interesting than if there was no cactus there. So look for foreground objects whenever you're doing sunsets. That'll be cool. Speaking of bodies of water, this is Solduck Falls, which is in Olympic National Park. And this is also a film shot. Man, I can't believe I found all these old film shots. This is one of my favorite places. This is an easy 1 mile hike from the parking lot. If you ever get a chance to go over to Olympic National Park, obviously it's very green there because it rains all the time. And this is only about 20 miles from the Hoh Rainforest, which is another great place.
Now, before go back to that for a second, Scott, because this is one of those things where people struggle with. And I think a lot of folks don't understand the technique behind a photo like this. So when you're doing this, Scott, typically I imagine you have either a neutral density filter on or you've stopped all the way down and went to your lowest ISO. I imagine you're using an ND filter here, right?
Well, actually, this is a super cloudy day, Rich.
Okay, so you just stopped all the way down and went to low ISO?
Actually, this is film. So this is Velvia film.
Okay.
Which we rated at ISO 40.
Okay.
So that'd be pretty low ISO. And this was shot at about f16 with a polarizing filter on, which has the same effect as about a -1.5 to -2 ND filter. So,
And then you
those
drag the
things,
shutter for 4 seconds or so?
yeah, those things allow for a long shutter speed, and that's a good point. That's how we get this cotton candy look here. If you like this look with your waterfalls or your water features, all you want to do is try to figure out a way to get a slow shutter. Now, Rich was giving you a tip there, and that is if it's a bright sunny day at 12 noon with all kinds of light, you can still make this photo. You're just going to need about 11 to 15 stops in neutral density filter to pull it off. But
Yeah.
whatever you can do to slow that shutter speed down will give you this feeling of motion. And by the way, had I photographed this at 1,000th of a second and froze in the water, in my opinion, it's not as powerful that way. It doesn't tell the same story.
But you don't want to go too slow, folks. Otherwise, those foreground elements might move a lot with a breeze and it softens up the photo. So balance that out. Well, that's excellent. Now, folks, those of you watching, remember, this is interactive. So feel free to ask any questions that you have in the Q&A pod. I'll also be keeping an eye on the Google Plus page. So you are welcome to post questions there, and we will do our best to answer those questions during this Hangout. All right, Scott, so what's our next area of focus?
Well, we're going to talk about how you approach landscape photography. And by the way, this is a photograph that I made on film as well. This is black and white film. This is Neopan film and ISO 32. And this is a waterfall up on Mount Rainier. And this waterfall no longer exists because of a landslide that took place about 10 years ago. So don't ever think that the places you're photographing have been done to the point where there's no reason to photograph them anymore, because sometimes it may be the last photograph you ever make of an area. You cannot make this photo anymore on Mount Rainier, so that's kind of important. So different things you can think about when you're photographing. You can try minimalism. You can try to accentuate color. You can look for lines and layers and shapes, patterns, context. This is all to address the one thing I hear, Rich, from people that go out into nature and they go, well, I don't see what to shoot. Well, you want to go out with some sort of idea in mind, in my opinion, about what you want to accomplish. And I like to think of it as a mini personal project. For instance, one day, just go into nature and look strictly for lines or layers. That was kind of getting at what Rich was talking about, where he likes to have a foreground object, a middle ground, a background object, where they're all layered together to create a sort of an impression of a 3D world, even though it's a 2D medium. Sometimes you might want to just pick patterns, or just a very minimalistic thing like a red leaf on a red log, whatever it is you're going for color. These are all up to you. And this is where the difference between being a photographer and an artist comes in. You have to have a point of view. And these are just some of the points of view that you might experiment with. I'd encourage you, by the way, we'll have this available later at SlideShare, so you don't need to write all this down, but you can look at this later and maybe even add some things to this list. And then just start going out once a week and say, okay, today I'm going to do minimalism, tomorrow I'm going to do color, after that I'll try lines, then after that I'll try layers. Mess around with that. Rich, anything to add to that?
Well, we have some good questions that came in that build off of this and also address the last section. So Glenn asked about what millimeter lens do you find using the most, and this I think varies greatly. I tend to shoot a bit wider unless I'm doing stitch panoramas, but for me, it's probably in the realm of 28 to 50, depending upon what I'm shooting. Scott, do you have any input on that? Obviously, it varies, but you're probably not doing a lot of telephoto on your landscape work.
Not really. This is a 20. That's a 20. That's a 50, actually. So on the wider side is where I usually go with my landscapes, although I'm going to get to some photos here in a bit. I think I have them in here, where I used a very long telephoto lens to compress the distance to get a nice look with the patterns and the lines. That's the great thing about landscape photography. You can literally use any lens, although I will say that traditionally, people do tend to default to the super wides in order to be able to tell more of a story. But I think a full-blown landscape kit needs to cover everything from about 20 to 300 millimeters, because, as you said, Rich, now that we have the ability to do these stitch panoramics so easily, there's no reason not to take the look at maybe, hey, I'll shoot this with a 200 or 300. I'll shoot 12 or 15 exposures horizontally and vertically and stitch them all together and make a mega image that would give me the same field of view as if I had a 20. There'll just be a lot more data.
Yeah, and a lot more resolution and flexibility to correct. Questions are pouring in. A couple other questions about filters. square filters versus screw-on, and you mentioned a polarizer earlier, Scott, in relationship to shooting water. Talk just a little bit about how a polarizer comes in handy if you are shooting landscapes. Is it just for water scenes, or do you use it for other issues too?
Well, let's start with polarizers. I like to use circular polarizers, screw-on types. They're easier to control. And circular polarizers as opposed to linear polarizers. The main reason being that linear polarizers can mess with autofocus. So I use circular polarizers. And what the job of a polarizer is to cut reflections in a scene. So in this photograph, you can look at the black rocks. They have a tiny bit of shine on them, but without a polarizer, those would be almost reflective and blow out. So the polarizer just cuts the shine off of a reflection. It'll cut through the reflections. If you're doing a color photograph, a polarizer, for instance, will take the colors and make them appear to pop, not because it's actually changing the color, but more because it's cutting through the sun's glare that would create minimal reflections and refractions that reduce your ability to see color saturation. So polarizers are one of the few filters that are very difficult, if not impossible, to recreate in digital, and the kind of filter I still use and put on my camera. Although I used to use a ton of glass filters, I don't use many anymore, but I still use the polarizer for this very reason. It's great at bluing up a sky, for instance, or cutting the reflection off the fall foliage, or mostly for water.
And to that end, think of it as sort of the original dehaze filter.
Oh,
So
yeah.
now there was one other question here about tripods, just to revisit, and I think it could be summarized. And that came down to this idea of, is the Me Photo stuff enough? And I don't want to pick on Me Photo, these ultra lightweight tripods. For me, I'm finding that most of the time, stepping up to just a beefier carbon fiber one, I can get the weight down. And if I'm really concerned about weight, sometimes I'll use things like a platypod and just put the tripod, replace that and go low to the ground or use a surface. But those really lightweight tripods are often a little too lightweight, and I would go somewhere in between, a lighter pro tripod to get the stability. If not, you need to look to hang a weight or a hook or your bag from it and get lower to the ground. That Me Photo and tripods like that are okay at one stage, but if I extend that all the way up, it's a pretty rickety thing.
Well, I will say this about the Me Photo stuff. If all you're doing is shooting with some mirrorless cameras and you don't have super long lenses, I actually think the Me Photo can work. I've used the Me Photo quite a lot. I like it again, but I'm like Rich. I'm going to use it at 2 to 3 feet, not 5 to 6 feet, and I'm going to use it with mirrorless only. If you want to get into anything beefier, I'd recommend stuff from 3Pod, which is an Anorama product, is a house brand, or the next step up is Enduro. Enduro is not quite as expensive as things like Gitzo or Really Right Stuff, but it's very high quality. The next step up would be Gitzo or Really Right Stuff. They tend to have lifetime guarantees. They're very expensive. You can spend $1,200 on a tripod without even thinking about it when you get into that price range. So there's an entire gamut, but
And so, and Scott, you might think less of me here, or you might think I'm clever. I tend to use Adorama tripod legs and Enduro tripod legs and Really Right Stuff ball heads. So,
well, there you go. I would use as much Really Right Stuff as you can afford. Let's put it like that. Really Right Stuff is sort of the pinnacle of the tripod business these days, but it is
you don't tell
wicked.
your spouse about it.
Yeah, this is stuff that when your spouse goes, "Is that a new tripod?" You just use this line. Oh, that old thing. See if that'll work for you. Yeah, that's that. But I mean, if you can afford it, that's what you want. But what I did find when I was starting out, Rich, was that I bought cheap tripods so many times because they would break or not do the job. Then I ended up paying more than I would have paid if I just bought the good one to begin with. This is the one area that I really want you to know you just cannot skimp in.
Yeah.
So think about that. All right. Well,
and Reed suggested a company called Slick. That's another manufacturer. There's lots of choices out there. So just read your reviews or borrow from your buddies. So that's a good idea. All right. So tell us about this image, Scott.
Well, this actually is an image that I did use an 800 millimeter lens to make. So this goes the completely opposite direction. This is made from Steptoe Butte in what we call the Palouse area of eastern Washington. This is one of the most under-photographed areas in the country, one of my favorite places to do landscape photography. This is taken from a little butte that was a failed volcano, actually, and I am like a mile away from this little grain place, but with the 800 millimeter lens, it compresses all these lines and it makes it look like the fields of hay in the background are just kind of like right up against this granary when in fact they're miles away. That's one of the advantages of a long lens, is it will compress items in the distance and give them the appearance of being closer than they really are. So this is one of those places where a long lens comes in super handy for landscape photography.
Okay, very cool.
And this is in the Lower Antelope Corkscrew Canyon, otherwise known as Slot Canyon, on Navajo land near Page, Arizona. And this is a 28 millimeter lens. Again with film, this is Velvia film. And when you shoot film, or when you shot film in the old days, you have to worry about a thing called reciprocity failure, where the long exposures would cause the film to shift, and the purples would really come from that. But this is actually one of my favorite landscape photos I've ever made. The Slot Canyons are a great place, but it goes to show you can be in canyons where you're not at the Grand Canyon and still find cool images.
Very cool.
This is from a recent trip shot on a Fuji X-T1, and this is at Teton National Park in Wyoming. And we were saying earlier that weather is your friend. Well, this is a perfect example. This is the morning fog. And as I was running in the morning to make a shoot, hopefully with some elk that I knew were bedded down, I stopped. My car did like a full-on around the corner when I saw this fog bank, and I jumped out and started shooting this because I just thought it had a very ethereal quality. And we talked earlier about using lines. You'll note on the bottom of the photograph there's a fence that sort of takes your eye into the fog bank. That was very deliberately placed there. It's a compositional aid that helps people understand where I want them to come into the photograph and then where I want them to go out of it.
Well, Scott, this brings up a good time to take Charles' question. Charles says, landscape pros usually recommend shooting in the golden hour when the light is really great, but are there any tips for dealing with midday light or when shooting landscapes? And, I think, obviously there's certain times a day when things are great. Get up early, stay up late, depending upon the season. But for me, an afternoon storm could be fantastic. And this is also why I love HDR photography, because I can capture scenes that are looking blown out and look harsh and bring back a lot of life by getting a smarter raw file. And we'll show you that workflow of how easy it is a little bit later. Most people don't realize how easy HDR is. And I'm not talking about over-processed HDR. I'm just talking about a super raw file that has more bit depth.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, HDR, there's no question about it, has extended my ability to make photographs at all hours of the day. The one thing is it's going to be pretty tough to find fog at noon, but sometimes you can pull it off.
San Francisco.
Yeah, there you go. This is at Julia Pfeiffer State Park on Big Sur, California. This is another shot where we used a slow shutter speed to create that motion that you see with the ocean dripping the white lines over the rocks and catching a little bit of the waterfall, slowing it down just a little bit. This was actually made on digital cameras using ISO 100 on a very cloudy day, which again allowed me to stop down to around f16 and still get a sharp image and still get a slow shutter speed. We're going to talk about composition. This particular photograph is very well balanced. You've got the waterfall on the left, you've got the waves on the right. That creates a balance, and that's something you want to look for in images. These are just basically some super easy, basic, standard compositional rules. All the rules of composition apply here that apply in most kinds of photography. You want to use the rule of thirds, and if you're not familiar with that, just draw an imaginary tic-tac-toe line across your image and try to have the main subject matter wherever those points intersect. Balance, which I just got through talking about, extremely important in landscape photography. If something is out of balance, if you see the image weighted really heavily one side or the other, it tends to be discomforting or disquieting to the viewer. So make sure that you're aware of that when you're putting your images together. Clean backgrounds. Now this is just a personal bias, but I love a clean background because it makes it easy for the viewer to know what it is you were trying to show me when I look at the photo. And John Shaw, who's an avid nature photographer, many of you don't know him, but back in the day, he was one of the most prolific amateur, or excuse me, pro shooters on the landscape circuit. He did a lot of magazine work, and he used to have a saying. He said the difference between a professional and an amateur photographer is the professional knows what not to include in the photo. So lots of clean backgrounds. Like you said, Rich's comment on layering is very important. We don't mean Photoshop layers. we mean compositional layers. Is there something in the foreground, something in the midground, something in the background that draws your attention? That gives this very real three-dimensional depth that we're talking about here.
And Scott, give a couple of examples of things that a amateur might not notice about their background. For me, it's things sometimes like power lines that could be avoided, or a tree branch sticking in and I don't see the whole tree.
Yeah, I call those intruders.
Okay.
And I have a simple exercise I call LUDA. Look up, look down, look all around. LUDA. Look up, look down, look all around. So what I try to do right before I take
the hokey pokey. Sorry.
We're going to make the dance next. I try to look at all four corners of my frame, Rich, before I press the shutter button. I want to make sure there's nothing like a telephone pole, wires, tree limbs, something that's extemporaneous to the image that's crept in that I haven't noticed. So really just take that extra second and look around. And one of the nice things about landscape photography is, that mountain's not going anywhere. It's been there probably for millions of years.
Right.
So let it be.
Now, we did have a good question from Glenn, and Scott, I think you and I could both tackle this. He said, what about laws that now restrict photography in national parks? And let me clarify here. There are laws there are laws that restrict photography in all sorts of places. It's typically commercial photography, and so that means you have the intent of selling the image. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not allowed to shoot in a national park. I've shot in national parks. It just often means that you need to get a permit. And this is not even sometimes that expensive to do. Scott, can you address this? If you do need to get a permit for shooting in some places, how do you go about that? What do you need to think about? My experience, a national park permit was typically $30 or so for most shooting days.
Well, just to be totally crystal clear, I'm not an attorney, and I would advise anyone who needs legal advice to seek out an attorney. But here's what my attorney told me. If you are in a national park, for instance, and national parks are not the end of this discussion, this is just the first part of it, then if you're doing an activity that any reasonable visitor to the park could expect to do, in other words, if you're not going off trail, if you're not asking Park Service employees to change the scenery, if you're not putting people in places that are off limits, if you're not tasking employees for security,
obstructing traffic,
you do not need a permit. Even if you're going to sell the photographs, you do not need a permit. What you need a permit for is if you're going to go out of bounds, if you're going to say, hey, that field over there is off limits, but I need to get into that field to make this commercial shoot, or I'm going to need 2 park employees with me today for security, or when you get into those kinds of things, then you will need a permit. And like you said, Rich, the good news is these permits are very affordable. People get scared off by this stuff. There's no need to be. But here's the simple way to answer this question, whether it's a state park, a county park, a city river system. The best way to find out is simply call whoever's in charge and ask. Just say, hey, I'm a professional photographer, amateur photographer, whatever. I'm going to do this. I'd like to go make photographs on this day at this. Here's what I'm going to use them for. Do I need a permit? If so, where do I get it? How much does it cost? And how long in advance do I have to apply? Most of the time, it's not a big deal. It's very rarely a big deal. And you can get in all kinds of places if you just ask.
Yeah, and when I had to shoot the other day at the Lincoln Memorial, I wanted to shoot a giant panorama of the Lincoln Memorial. I shot a 360 at night. We absolutely used a tripod, and we had to get a permit. And 4 times during the shoot while I was there, park police would come up. I'd show them the permit. They'd shake their head and walk away because we were fine. It was just a different person, because normally you're not allowed to have any tripods around any of the monuments here in DC. But we did it the right way. We got the permit, and I was absolutely able to shoot a beautiful nighttime panorama of this beautiful monument, and the reflecting pool is now filled again. I'm really happy with the image, all by just doing the right thing. Had I not, I would have been chased out in 5 minutes.
Yeah, and here's the thing. There are places where tripod permits are actually required. New
Yeah.
York City and Washington, D.C. have lots of rules about tripods that no place else does. And tripods will get you a lot of grief in some places. In some places, just ban them outright. But if it does require a permit, get it. Now, here's a trick that I use because I've actually been photographing in D.C. with a permit and had the same experience over a 3-day shoot. On day one, 3 different park policemen came up to bother me about my permit. I showed them to them. They walked off. On day 2, Rich, I taped the permit inside of a plastic sleeve and wore it on a string so that it was on my back. And people could walk up and I would just point to my back. I wouldn't even take my eye off the camera. I would just point to my back and say, read it. It's right there.
And on
they,
day 3, you just wore the permit and everyone ran away.
So days 2 and 3, nobody asked me anything because they saw the permit. And but yeah, this is really simple, folks. And here's another thing about this. If you ask permission, you will often not only be granted the permission for a small fee or sometimes even no fee, you also will often get help. I find that the Park Service employees they're Park Service employees because they love nature. It sure isn't for the money. They make about, $1,500 to $2,000 a month if they're lucky.
Yeah.
And some of them make a lot less than that. They're making minimum wage. They're not there because yeah. Listen, these people are there because they love the parks. That's why they're there. They're there. They want to help you. So ask them for help. They'll tell you, oh, by the way, did you notice that there's some elk down in the next ravine, or we saw some deer over here? They'll not only will they give you the permit, they'll tell you where to go shoot.
Yeah. All right. Give us a couple more tips, Scott. Then we're going to jump into some post-processing. We got about 20 minutes left in our webinar. Right. And great questions, folks. We really appreciate those coming in. Remember, we'll do a drawing here at the end for a couple of prizes, and everyone who's coming is going to get some free software today, too.
Okay. So next questions or next section is about light. You want to know where the direction of the light is coming from. If you're a landscape photographer, side lighting is your friend. That just means put yourself at a 45-degree angle to the sun. You can also backlight things like I did in that earlier picture of the cactus. Look for the quality of light. Do you want harsh light or do you want soft light? Do you want diffuse light? If you're shooting through fog and clouds, it's going to be diffuse. If you're shooting at midday, it's going to be harsh. Know about the color of light. Is it warm like at sunrise or sunset, or is it blue like on a cloudy day? And then how much or how little light do you need? These are very basic things that you have to be able to maintain some knowledge of if you want to have control over how your landscape photos come out. Where to shoot. This is Olympic National Park from a place called Hurricane Ridge. I will caution you, if you ever go there, the deer are so friendly. The biggest problem is they want to get in your car and go home with you. So local parks, lakes, rivers, forests, state parks, national wildlife refuges are some of my personal favorites. National parks, guided tours, photo workshops. I don't care where you live in the United States or Canada. There is a park, a lake, a river, or a forest close to you. If you live in the United States, there is a national wildlife refuge and or a national park within an hour's drive of something like 95% of the population, Rich.
And you can get a national parks pass, an annual pass, very cheap, which makes visiting lots of parks free.
It's $80 a year. If you're 16 or over, you need it. If you're under 16, it's free, and if you're 62 or over, it's $10 for life.
Yeah.
You pay $10 one time for life. So definitely want to go there. This is some miscellaneous tips. Now this happens to be the Grand Canyon, and to prove that you can do this with any kind of camera, I shot this with a little Nikon point and shoot, and it was published by Nikon. So there you go.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, miscellaneous tips. We're going to get into some demos real quick on this. Stitch panoramas, HDR, black and white. This is all real easy to do with software.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to show you. I love panoramas too. Rich and I both have this in common. These are 2 different pictures from 2 different mountain ranges inside the Teton National Park at 2 different times a year. The top one is obviously in fall, and I really like the way this image came up. This is 9 photographs stitched together. I shot these vertically, by the way. That's a tip for you pano shooters. Shoot vertically. You have way more information to stitch together. The bottom one is 4 pictures or 5 pictures, I can't remember, which I converted to black and white. And you know, this is one of the places where it's okay to break the rule, put the subject dead center, because here the reflection was killer. These are two more panos, also from Teton National Park. This is another pano of that fog shot that I made right after I made the first one. I went ahead and backed up a little bit and made the second one because I love that fog with the mountain range.
Very cool.
This is an HDR shot. Now, I like to use this shot as an example because people think of HDR as like, oh my gosh, it's gaudy and it's wicked and it's too much color. Well, this is pretty much an exact approximation of what I saw when I was standing in Yosemite National Park the day I made the photograph. But I could have never shot this with conventional photography because there was too many stops of latitude between the darkest dark and the brightest bright. So this is one of the ways you can use HDR. This is black and white. This is just fortuitous, some family coming by on a raft when I was at Half Dome. This is Mount Rainier National Park. Once again, using leading lines. Notice that the way the water had run down the hill, it created these lines which pointed towards the mountain. There you go. So now we're going to get into post-processing. I don't know why I have this picture of a wolf here, but okay.
Because it's time for post-processing. All right. Well, so a couple of questions here that came up, and people are asking about, how can we do this? What about bracketing? I'm going to show you really quick some bracketing. And one of the things to realize, guys, is that bracketing is easy. Just about every camera has bracketing built in. You can do this. It's not always just 3 exposures. People think, oh, you just turn it on. It's 3 exposures, triple exposure, I'm done. Sometimes you need more exposures. It depends. Now, I'm going to show you this instance here, and I'm just going to use Adobe Bridge for this. Let me just switch over here and start my screen share. And Scott, do you see Adobe Bridge?
I see you. I see Adobe Bridge.
Perfect. All right. So here I have a waterfall. And if you take a look, you can see that we went from really overexposed, which put a lot of detail into the trees, and then really underexposed, which did a good job on the sky, but made everything else quite muddy. And whether you use Lightroom or Photoshop now, what a lot of people don't realize is that you've got a merge to HDR right there. So you could just select all those images in Camera Raw or in Lightroom and say merge to HDR. Now, I'm a big fan of Photomatix, and I'll usually do more advanced merges there. And we've got an HDR Hangout and a bunch of tutorials on PhotoFocus to show you this. But my point is that this is now built in right to Lightroom and right to Photoshop because they thought that expanded dynamic range was pretty important. And so it goes through, it analyzes the image, it looks at this, and it's going to create a new file. And you see how it took essentially the best parts of each image and brought out the sky, brought out everything else. So when I click merge, it's going to make a new DNG file. And that DNG file basically has super shadow highlight sliders. Like, you know what? Lift up the shadows even more than you could with the raw file. Go ahead and bring down the blacks a little bit. And I'm just going to pull down the exposure for the sky. And it looks pretty good. Once I have that and I'm ready, we can open that object up. Now, this object is stored there. If I click done, you'll see that it's just going to pop up right there as a new raw file, and it's ready to go. So you can open that up, send it on over to a tool like Photoshop, or do this in Lightroom, and it comes in. And I'm just going to recrop this a little bit to focus on the good stuff. But one of the things that I'm going to show you is that you can sometimes bring out a little bit more information. Let's just go ahead and I'll uncrop that really quick. And just recrop here. I've got a couple of intruders there that you talked about, like those things sticking through, so I'll have to take some of those out carefully. But for now, we'll work with this. And one of the things I like is that I can bring out a little bit of extra information. So this is actually free software, Scott. This is Perfect Exposure, and thanks to Perfectly Clear for making that free. Everyone who's here today is going to get a copy of it. And they've got a bunch of great ways to just bring out some of those details. And everything you do here can be tweaked. So if it's too strong, you could just back that off a little bit. But if we look at that, I really like how some of the details that were lost in the shadows have been lifted and brought back out. And so it's a simple fix, but that's one of those things that often is lacking. So that's an HDR merge, and the panos the exact same way. You could just select a range of pictures in Lightroom or inside of Adobe Camera Raw, choose to open those in Camera Raw, or Lightroom and just invoke the merge to panorama command. And it's going to analyze all those images and it's looking for overlap. So when you shoot these, shoot them with about 25 to 30% overlap as you pan the camera. And what that does is it will find where they overlap. Now, I've already invoked that merge command. This is that part that looks like paint drying, so I'm going to hit cancel. It'll take a couple of minutes. It's not fun to watch, but look at what it does. You know, it stitched all of that into an Uber file. And I'm sorry, but this just blows away the detail of what you can get in a single exposure. I was able to shoot incredible amounts of information. Now, I've got some schmutz on there that I'm going to have to clean up, but it was a very windy day. But look at all that. Look at all the information with that panoramic view.
And by the way, Rich, I noticed that created a 93 megapixel file. So
just a little big, yeah, high res.
Stick that in your full frame sensor and view.
Yeah, this was shot on a D7000, which certainly is not 93 megapixels. So, and again, you have all the flexibility of RAW. This is still a RAW file. So you can make all of those adjustments that you normally would to a RAW file. And so that was one of the reasons why people didn't do panoramas or HDRs, is they thought, well, you know, I'm giving something up, but you're not. You got total flexibility there. So Scott, any questions pop up during that, or should I show you have anything you want to add before I show some other?
Keep going. I think you're on a roll.
All right. So let's take a look here. I've got a wide range. You mentioned the river, the flowing water, the cotton candy, right?
Yep.
So I did not have an ND filter here. So I simply went to my lowest ISO, which was 50. This was shot on a A7S and an A7R, I think. And I just simply shot that there. And I went to f22 so that I got a small opening, and I was able to drag the shutter for 6 seconds, which did that whole thing that we wanted on the water there. Now, what I'll often do is slightly underexpose that RAW file. I find that getting a slight underexposure is often a bit better. I'll back those blacks down, and I stay away from clarity and vibrance. I try to not use those because they tend to not give me the results that I want. They tend to be a little bit aggressive. Now, if I open that up and bring that into Photoshop, let's use that same free software here. This is the perfect exposure version, and this is what everybody gets today. And you'll see there that I can bring that up very quickly and lift that out, or there's a simple outdoor. And it just puts life back into the image, and you still have total control. What I like are these controls: high contrast versus high definition. If you like clarity, you now have twice as many clarity choices. So you have Photoshop's clarity, and now you have 2 more for free. And you can see as we toggle between those how it deals with the black point and the contrast. And it's analyzing each pixel, and there's even this cool option called light diffusion, which softens the light in the entire scene. So even though I shot this in the middle of the afternoon, I can get softer diffused light very quickly. And I want to
point out, Rich, one of the presets there that you had available to you was dehaze.
Yeah.
And you don't even have to have Lightroom to get that. You get it for free today.
Yeah.
You can get your own. You can get your own version of dehaze without Lightroom using perfect exposure, which I think is pretty cool.
So yeah, this is a bit of a hazy shot. It's a nighttime shot, and I just want to put some extra detail into that. So let's invoke that. And this is, again, the free software that everyone gets today. And so there's the dehaze. And now, if it's a little bright, you still could just back that off, but the depth is so much better. Look at the amount of detail that was lifted out. And you can, of course, back that down or fade it off if it's too strong. But I really think that it did a nice job of lifting out some of those details that were being lost.
And also, it does all that, Rich, without changing color.
Yeah, and that's kind of cool. So let me show what Scott's referencing there. So here's a challenge that we often face when we're dealing with exposure and such. So let's say that I get this image open, and I get it where it's about right, and I'm going to put a little graduated filter in here from the top just to pull that down. I like to do that little trick there in Lightroom or Photoshop. Use the graduated filter, roll it just a little bit towards blue, and darken it so I'm making a grad in post. And okay, it's kind of there, but if we look at it, it just doesn't have the exposure that I want. So I lift up the shadows a little bit. You see this giant hole in the histogram. Well, okay, I'll click open, and here's the thing. If I try to tackle this with a traditional adjustment, let's say I use a levels adjustment, and I pull the white point over, notice that what happened was the color got washed out. It shifted the color. So normally, as you make a change in exposure, color changes. So if you darken an image, the color is going to get more intense. See how it gets more saturated? And if I lighten an image, the color gets desaturated. That's just how normal adjustments work. But Perfect Exposure, which is free for everyone, has a patent that allows us, when we adjust the exposure, that the color never shifts no matter how we adjust the exposure. So there's their dehaze. It just took the muddiness in that landscape and got rid of it. And no change in color or tonality. And you can choose from high definition or higher contrast, depending upon how you want the blacks to react, which I like. So simple, fast, easy, and free for everyone today. So let me put that web page up, and then we'll actually have some prizes. Whoa, screen share. So, so if you want to do that, let me just screen share one more time, and hopefully it won't go crazy. I'm going to share this web window. Do you see the web window, Scott?
I see a black window.
There we go.
There it is.
Okay, so this is easy. You just go to Athentech's website, athentech.com, and thank you to them for sponsoring today. And if you click on products, Perfect Exposure, it is 100% free. So there are 8 different presets in here that are designed for different shooting situations. This Fix Dark is really good at fixing a dark photo and getting rid of noise. We've got a dehaze. So if you're not using the latest version of Photoshop or Lightroom, you now have dehaze. This is actually one of Scott's pictures. And Scott and a couple of the folks at Photo Focus actually designed the presets so that they said, well, you know what? We want professional photographers and enthusiast photographers to help us make the right presets. So we actually helped design those. So I was real happy. And you could see some before and afters of some of these images. So there's one of Scott's photos, and you can see how it brought out some of that exposure. Here's one from one of our writers, Robert Finelli. And here's another one of an outdoor shot. And here's one of mine. And just to be able to get a more vibrant nighttime photo without losing the sense of it being cool and at night. I like that the color was preserved. So you can absolutely download that totally free and put that into play. So let me go ahead and switch back here, and we'll give away some free stuff and answer a couple of questions here. So let's see here. We're going to give away some free stuff, but real quick questions. Any preference on pano style, perspective versus spherical or cylindrical? The only time that you need to worry about spherical is if you're doing things where you're trying to do more of a 360. So perspective is fine if you've got something that's strong in the center that you're building off of, and cylindrical is going to work for most situations. But the tools in Lightroom are very forgiving. Same with Photoshop. It'll tell you which one is right. So you don't have to worry about that too much. Auto is usually going to be fine. If you're dealing with the 360, that's a little bit trickier. And then any standard guidelines on how many degrees you cover in a single panorama? Well, it's all about time. So if you are shooting something where the clouds are really moving fast, you might go a bit wider and shoot 2 or 3 shots quickly, right, Scott? Versus if you were doing something where you had all the time in the world, then you might punch in on a 300 millimeter lens and barely turn, still making sure you had overlap.
Yeah, wind is the main thing that I look at as a factor when I'm doing my panos in the landscape. If there's a lot of wind, I don't mess around, because it's gonna cause everything to move, and that's gonna create ghosting. So I agree with your approach, Rich.
All right, cool. And last couple questions here before we give away some prizes. There is no advantage to underexposing. You only get a lower quality image with more noise in the shadows. Not really with RAW, and I'm not saying underexpose. I'm developing my RAW file a little bit. I find it's easier to add back than it is to pull down. So well, I prefer to slightly underexpose.
I think I know what the confusion there is, Rich.
Sure.
You weren't advising people to capture the image underexposed. You were saying that in camera raw, you might shade it a little to the left because then you got more stuff to work with in terms of the saturation and stuff like that. That's an old trick we used to do with slide film.
Yeah. And so I find it easier to pull a little stuff back when I process the raw file. If I'm shooting something where you're not shooting in manual mode, I might meter a third of a stop under sometimes just to keep a little more details in the clouds. But raw files are so flexible, so it's not a big deal. All right. And then last questions we had here, we have 2 about circular polarizers and 1 about drones. Yes, if you're going to shoot with a drone and you're shooting landscape photography, you're probably on somebody's property, you probably need a permit, and people are paranoid about drones. We have a total free class up on PhotoFocus all about how to register your drone properly if you're in the United States. So you can take a look at that. It's totally free, and it'll walk you through the whole process on how to be legal with your drone. And then beyond that, just make sure you have the property owner's permission where you're flying from. But there is no, people, you are still allowed to shoot things, but many national parks and others consider drones a nuisance, and you'll see drone-free zones where they don't want people flying them over tourists or in other areas. But if you're in a private property and you have permission of the property owner, you don't really need permission to shoot the landscape, just permission to stand where you're standing.
Unless you're going to use the photograph commercially.
Then get a lawyer. All right, last questions. We're basically with a circular polarizer. What happens if the lens hood gets in the way? And what happens if we're seeing a band in it, Scott? So go ahead and stop screen sharing and maybe you can answer that one and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, I didn't know. Am I still screen sharing?
Yep, just click click the screen share done button so we can see your lovely face. There we go. All right, so just give us quick advice on circular polarizers, then we'll wrap.
All right. Well, some of the new lenses actually have a little slit in them that you can stick your finger in to turn the circular polarizer. A lot of the new telephoto lenses have that feature. If they don't, then unfortunately, what you have to do is take the lens hood off, adjust the circular polarizer, put the lens hood back on. It's kind of a hassle, but it's definitely worth it because the flare that you might get from adding a new piece of glass on top of the lens is it's more likely you'll get flare. So you want to have that lens hood. And what was the second question, Rich?
How do you adjust it, or what happens if you see a black line going through the middle?
Well, you just got to, one of the nice things about most cameras is they'll let you have a what you see is what you get view. So just dial it back. One of the biggest mistakes that amateurs make, Rich, is they use too much polarizer.
Okay, so back that off.
I would say, it's better to put 1 shake of salt in the stew and taste it than to put the whole jar in and then taste it. You can always add a little bit more salt, but it's harder once you put a lot in. So just back it off. Just use a little circular polarizer because you'd be surprised how far it can go.
All right, excellent. Well, we're having just a little lag with Google, of course, and hey, it's the end of the day, so the internet is tired, but let's give away some prizes. First off, we did say that everyone who attended, and of course, actually everybody, thanks to folks, you could share that link at Perfectly Clear. Perfect Exposure is 100% free. All they ask is an email address, and what you'll get is an email or so a month with a newsletter with some extra tips and things like that. But you can try that out. It's never going to expire. You can absolutely use that, so I hope that that's helpful. We're going to give away 2 copies of Scott's Americana book and 1 copy of the full version of Perfectly Clear for Lightroom and Photoshop. So I'm going to draw those names now. And if you are a winner, you just need to send an email to Rich at PhotoFocus and Scott at PhotoFocus. Just send it to both of us. Say, I'm a winner. Please make sure you actually were named as the winner. We do write the names down. So some people are like, I think I won. I don't think so, but that's a good try. So today, everybody won. Everybody gets free software. But if your name is George McCain, George, you win a copy of Scott's Americana book. And if your name is Nick Morales, you also win that. And that's the Americana book. And if your name is Glenn Hewitt, you win a copy of Perfectly Clear. So just drop us a line. We'll be happy to give that to you, and we'll get that out. Just give us a couple of days to get through the emails and make sure that arrives. But just reach out to Rich at PhotoFocus and Scott at PhotoFocus. Scott, thanks so much for joining us today. Any parting advice to folks?
Well, just go out there and have fun. You can only make pictures when you actually have a camera in your hand. So don't spend all your life on the computer looking at this stuff. Go out and actually shoot. And I will have this whole presentation. There was a few slides we didn't get to. It'll be up on SlideShare, and we'll link it in a post at photofocus.com when we do the rebroadcast of this webinar.
Yep, we will put this webinar up there. You can go back if you missed part of this webinar and rewatch it, and Scott will share those slides. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. My name is Rich Harrington. I'm the publisher of PhotoFocus. Scott Bourne is the founder of that site, and more than 20 other photographers are sharing their tips, techniques, and information absolutely for free. So make sure you check out photofocus.com, and if you haven't, you can actually post your photos to our communities, and we pick people every single day to put the spotlight on, so you could be one of our featured photographers. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you found the webinar helpful, and we really appreciate you all coming out. Bye-bye.